The quietest person in the room is not always the weakest. Sometimes they are simply the last one willing to give up on the people they love. I did not understand the meaning of those words until the night my entire family fell silent around my sister's dining table. My name is Evelyn Brooks, and I am 72 years old. I have spent a lifetime believing that experience teaches you how to judge character. I raised a son, cared for a husband until his final days, survived grief that changed the sound of my own home, and watched generations of my family gather around holiday tables filled with laughter, traditions, and stories. I thought I understood people. Looking back now, I realize I only understood the versions they allowed me to see. That Friday evening was supposed to be ordinary. My older sister Linda insisted on hosting one of her famous family dinners, something she loved doing every few months. She always made sure the house looked perfect. The polished hardwood floors reflected the warm light from the dining room chandelier. Fresh white lilies stood proudly in the middle of the long oak table. Crystal glasses sparkled beside neatly folded linen napkins. Everything looked elegant enough to belong in a home magazine, and Linda loved that feeling almost as much as she loved reminding everyone how much work she had put into creating it. Daniel arrived first, carrying a homemade pecan pie. My son had always been dependable, even if work kept him busier than any of us liked. A moment later, Grace walked in behind him with her familiar gentle smile, wearing a soft blue sweater and dark jeans. She greeted every person in the room before quietly asking Linda whether she could help in the kitchen. Linda accepted without looking up from arranging serving dishes. It was such a familiar exchange that no one seemed to notice it anymore. Grace always offered. Everyone always accepted. I watched her disappear into the kitchen before she had even removed her light jacket. That was simply what she did. For 12 years, she had found ways to make every family gathering easier for everyone else. She remembered birthdays without reminders, baked favorite desserts from memory, and somehow knew exactly how each person liked their coffee. None of those things seemed extraordinary anymore, because she had done them for so long that we started expecting them instead of appreciating them. I am ashamed to admit that I had become one of those people. When dinner finally began, conversation floated naturally from neighborhood news to rising grocery prices, grandchildren, and vacation plans. Linda controlled the discussion the way she always did. Michael laughed loudly at nearly everything his mother said. Daniel smiled politely while answering questions about work. Grace spoke only when someone asked her something directly, and even then her answers were thoughtful, brief, and sincere. Watching her, I wondered whether she genuinely preferred silence or whether silence had simply become the safest place inside our family. The evening changed almost too slowly to notice. Linda corrected Grace over a simple recipe, even though everyone agreed the mashed potatoes were delicious. Michael joked that Grace probably spent more time in the kitchen than at the table because she enjoyed taking care of everyone. A few relatives chuckled politely. Grace smiled and quietly passed the dinner rolls without responding. Daniel glanced toward her before lowering his eyes to his plate. That small moment stayed with me. It lasted only a second, yet it felt strangely important. As dessert was served, Grace stood once again to refill coffee cups before pouring one for herself last. She thanked Linda for hosting, complimented the meal, and asked whether anyone wanted another slice of pie. Her kindness never sounded forced. It came as naturally as breathing. Yet something about the room felt different now. The laughter had become thinner. The smiles looked practiced. I began noticing details that had escaped me for years. Every time Grace helped someone, people accepted it without acknowledgement. Every time someone interrupted her, the conversation simply moved on. Nobody intended to be cruel. That was the uncomfortable truth. We had simply become so accustomed to her patience that we stopped seeing the person behind it. I felt a quiet ache settle in my chest as I looked around the table. For the first time in many years, I was no longer watching my family through the eyes of habit. I was seeing them exactly as they were. And deep inside, I sensed that before the evening was over, the woman everyone believed would remain silent was about to change every one of us forever. As I watched Grace quietly gather empty plates from the table, memories began returning one after another, not because I was searching for them, but because they suddenly refused to stay hidden. They were ordinary memories, the kind most people forget because nothing dramatic happened in them. Yet I was beginning to understand that families are rarely shaped by dramatic moments. They are shaped by countless ordinary ones. Grace had been part of our family for almost 12 years. I still remembered the afternoon Daniel introduced her to me at a small neighborhood coffee shop. She wore a simple cream-colored blouse, smiled with quiet sincerity, and listened far more than she spoke. When Daniel stepped away to order our drinks, she looked at me with nervous honesty and said, "I know your family means everything to him. I hope that one day I can earn a place in it." Those words stayed with me because they sounded genuine. She was not trying to impress me. She simply wanted to belong. Looking back now, I realize she spent the next 12 years trying to keep that promise. Every Thanksgiving she arrived before sunrise to help prepare the meal. Every Christmas she remembered each person's favorite dessert without writing anything down. She never forgot birthdays, anniversaries, or little traditions that everyone else eventually left to her. If someone became ill, Grace was the first to organize meals. If an elderly neighbor needed groceries after a snowstorm, she quietly filled her trunk with shopping bags and delivered them without mentioning it afterward. She never announced her kindness because she never treated it like an accomplishment. It was simply the way she chose to live. The strange thing was that the more dependable she became, the less anyone seemed to notice. Dependability slowly turned into expectation. Gratitude quietly disappeared. Even I had fallen into that habit without realizing it. I remembered the winter after my husband passed away. My house had never felt so empty. Friends visited during the first few weeks, but life eventually pulled everyone back to their routines. Grace never disappeared. Every Saturday morning she arrived with fresh groceries, brewed coffee exactly the way my husband liked it, helped organize my medications, and sat beside me without trying to fill every silence with comforting words. Sometimes we simply watched the birds gather outside the kitchen window while snow covered the backyard. Those silent mornings carried me through grief more than any speech ever could. I thanked her many times, yet I never truly understood the size of the gift she had given me. Sitting at Linda's dining table now, I suddenly saw those memories differently. Grace had always offered people what they needed instead of what brought attention to herself. That kind of generosity is easy to overlook because it does not ask to be noticed. Across the table, Linda laughed while describing an upcoming charity event, proudly mentioning the names of local business owners who would be attending. Michael joked about how successful networking mattered more than anything else these days. Daniel smiled politely, though I could tell his thoughts were somewhere else. Grace quietly returned to her chair after placing the last serving bowl in the kitchen. She thanked Linda again for inviting everyone and complimented the homemade apple crisp. Linda accepted the compliment with a nod before immediately changing the subject. Nobody acknowledged that Grace had prepared nearly half the meal before arriving. Nobody mentioned that she had spent the last hour making sure everyone else remained comfortable. The realization settled heavily inside me. We had become experts at appreciating effort only when it attracted attention. Quiet service had become invisible simply because it was consistent. I looked at Grace more carefully than I ever had before. She did not appear tired or resentful. She looked peaceful, almost as though she had already accepted something the rest of us had yet to understand. For the first time in many years, I found myself wondering whether silence had never been her weakness at all. Perhaps it had always been a choice. And if that was true, then I could not help asking myself what would happen on the day she finally decided that silence had done enough. The conversation around the table drifted naturally from one familiar subject to another, but I found it harder and harder to listen. My attention kept returning to Grace. For years I had looked at her the way people often look at the sunrise every morning. It was always there, always dependable, and because of that, it slowly became something we stopped noticing. That realization unsettled me more than anything Linda or Michael had said all evening. Grace quietly reached for the basket of warm dinner rolls and offered them to each person before taking one for herself last. Nobody thanked her. Nobody even seemed aware she had done it. It was such a small moment that it would have disappeared from memory under ordinary circumstances, yet somehow it stayed with me. I began wondering how many similar moments had filled the last 12 years without anyone truly seeing them. Linda leaned back comfortably and complimented Daniel on his recent promotion. She proudly remarked that long hours and determination were the reasons successful people achieve their goals. Then she smiled politely toward Grace and added that it certainly helped to have someone at home willing to handle all the little things. Michael laughed and agreed that every successful man needed someone who enjoyed staying in the background. A few relatives smiled awkwardly before looking down at their plates. Grace simply nodded and wished Daniel continued success at work. There was not the slightest trace of jealousy in her voice. She sounded genuinely proud of him. I looked at Daniel, expecting him to say something in return, but he only smiled faintly before changing the subject to football. That quiet decision troubled me far more than Michael's careless joke. Daniel had never been unkind. He simply believed avoiding conflict protected everyone. Perhaps he did not realize that silence sometimes protects the wrong things. Another memory quietly surfaced. A few years earlier, I had stopped by Daniel and Grace's home without calling first. Daniel had been delayed at the office, but Grace welcomed me inside with her usual warmth. Dinner simmered gently on the stove, and fresh bread cooled on the kitchen counter. During the next hour, the telephone rang several times. One call came from a volunteer coordinator at the community center. Another came from an elderly neighbor needing a ride to a medical appointment. A third came from a young mother asking whether Grace could watch her children for an afternoon while she attended a job interview. Grace agreed to each request with calm kindness, writing every appointment into a small notebook she kept beside the refrigerator. I remember asking whether she ever became tired of everyone depending on her. She smiled and answered that people usually asked for help only after trying to solve problems themselves. She believed saying yes whenever she could was one small way of making the world gentler. At the time, I admired her generosity. Now I realize something more important. She gave so much of herself without expecting recognition that people eventually forgot those gifts were choices instead of obligations. The dining room suddenly felt smaller. Every conversation seemed to reveal another invisible habit our family had developed. Grace was expected to help. Grace was expected to understand. Grace was expected to forgive. None of those expectations had ever been spoken aloud. They had simply become normal through repetition. I felt embarrassed that I had participated in that pattern without questioning it. Grace reached for the coffee pot and quietly refilled my cup before I even noticed it was nearly empty. When I thanked her, she smiled with the same gentle warmth she had shown me since the day we first met. There was nothing forced about it. She treated kindness the way other people treated breathing. Watching her, I no longer saw a woman who lacked confidence. I saw someone carrying remarkable self-control. The difference between weakness and restraint suddenly became impossible to ignore. Around us, the conversation continued, but the room no longer felt ordinary. Something invisible had shifted inside me. I had started the evening believing I knew exactly who my daughter-in-law was. Now I wondered whether she was the only person at the table who had understood our family all along, and whether every quiet moment we had overlooked was leading us toward a truth that could no longer remain hidden. As dessert plates were quietly cleared from the table, I realized I was no longer listening to the conversation itself. Instead, I was listening to the spaces between the words. Those quiet pauses revealed more than anything people actually said. Linda continued telling stories about community events and old family friends, comfortably guiding every discussion the way she always had. Michael eagerly agreed with nearly everything she said, laughing a little louder than necessary whenever she made a clever remark. Daniel smiled politely, answering questions about work with short responses before falling silent again. Grace remained exactly where she had been for most of the evening, present without demanding attention, engaged without trying to control the room. Yet somehow she was becoming the only person I could truly see. I remembered a spring afternoon several years earlier when Linda had undergone knee replacement surgery. Everyone in the family had promised to help during her recovery, but as the weeks passed, work schedules became busy, vacations had already been planned, and ordinary life slowly pulled everyone away. Grace never mentioned any of that. Every Tuesday and Friday, she prepared homemade soup, fresh bread, and simple dinners before driving across town to leave them on Linda's porch. She never rang the doorbell if Linda happened to be resting. She simply sent a short message saying the food was waiting outside. Not once did she mention those visits during family gatherings. I glanced toward Linda now and wondered whether she even remembered them. Perhaps she did. Perhaps she had simply grown so accustomed to receiving quiet kindness that she no longer recognized it when it stood directly in front of her. The thought saddened me more than I expected. Grace reached for the coffee pot once again and noticed that Michael's cup was nearly empty. Before he even asked, she gently refilled it and offered fresh coffee to everyone else around the table. Michael accepted with a distracted nod while continuing his conversation. He never looked up long enough to thank her. Grace did not seem offended. She simply smiled politely and returned to her seat. Watching that small exchange, I suddenly understood how habits quietly shape relationships. No one had deliberately decided that Grace would always serve while everyone else received. It had happened one ordinary moment at a time until the pattern became invisible. I thought about something my late husband used to tell our son when he was young. He often said that character is revealed by how people treat the person who quietly makes their life easier. At the time, I believed he was talking about strangers. Sitting there now, I realized he had been talking about family all along. The warmth of the dining room suddenly felt different. The golden light reflecting across crystal glasses could not hide the uncomfortable truth settling inside me. Grace had spent years building bridges between people while asking for nothing in return. Somehow the rest of us had crossed those bridges so often that we stopped noticing who had built them. Linda leaned back in her chair and smiled as she complimented herself on keeping family traditions alive. She spoke proudly about hosting holiday dinners and preserving memories for the next generation. Nobody disagreed. Those gatherings were important, and she truly had worked hard to organize them. Yet I found myself asking a question I had never considered before. What gives traditions their meaning? Is it beautiful decorations, perfectly arranged tables, and carefully prepared recipes? Or is it the quiet people who fill those moments with generosity that nobody remembers to acknowledge? I looked toward Grace again. She had folded her napkin neatly beside her plate and was listening with complete attention, her expression peaceful, her posture relaxed, her eyes filled with the same quiet warmth she always carried. There was no frustration, no disappointment, and certainly no desire to embarrass anyone. That calm no longer looked like surrender to me. It looked like remarkable discipline. Deep inside, I felt a growing certainty that Grace had been observing all of us just as carefully as I had begun observing her. The difference was that she had understood our family long before I ever did. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing with complete confidence. The silence surrounding Grace was no longer empty. It was gathering meaning, and when it finally broke, every person sitting around that table would hear something they could never forget. The evening continued with the familiar rhythm that had always defined our family gatherings, yet nothing felt familiar to me anymore. It was as though someone had quietly cleaned a dusty window, allowing me to see people I had known for decades with complete clarity for the very first time. The conversation moved toward family finances, retirement plans, and rising home values across the neighborhood. Linda enjoyed these topics because they allowed her to compare accomplishments without appearing impolite. She praised Michael for a recent investment, congratulated a cousin who had purchased a larger home, and proudly mentioned several influential people she had recently met through charity events. Then she smiled toward Daniel. "You have always worked harder than anyone else in this family," she said warmly. "It helps that Grace keeps life simple for you." Daniel forced a polite smile, but remained silent. Before I could think, I looked toward Grace. She was already looking at Daniel, not with disappointment, but with quiet encouragement. She reached across the table and gently rested her hand over his for only a brief moment before returning it to her lap. That simple gesture carried more affection than 100 carefully chosen words. It reminded me that real support often happens without anyone else noticing. I suddenly remembered a conversation Daniel and I had shared several years earlier after he received an offer to accept a demanding executive position nearly 2,000 miles away. The salary would have been remarkable, but the schedule required constant travel and weeks away from home. Daniel confessed that he had almost accepted immediately because he believed success meant providing as much financial security as possible. A few days later, he called me again. He sounded different. He told me Grace had encouraged him to think beyond money. She asked him what kind of memories he wanted to build over the next 20 years. Did he want children and nieces remembering expensive vacations? Or did he want them remembering that he was always present for birthdays, school concerts, weekend breakfasts, and ordinary evenings around the dinner table? Daniel eventually declined the promotion. At the time, I quietly wondered whether Grace had influenced him to settle for less. Sitting there now, I finally understood the opposite was true. She had helped him choose the richer life. Looking around the table, I realized how strange it was that everyone admired Daniel's balanced family life, while almost nobody recognized the person who had quietly protected it. Linda continued speaking, explaining that every successful family depended on people understanding their responsibilities. Michael laughed and added that dependable people made life easier because they never complained. Grace smiled politely, but said nothing. I noticed something I had missed before. Her silence no longer felt passive. It felt intentional, almost as though she had already weighed every possible response and decided that none of them would accomplish what she truly wanted. That realization stayed with me. People often assume the strongest person is the one who speaks first. Perhaps true strength belongs to the person who knows exactly when words are worth using. Across the table, Daniel slowly looked toward his wife. There was gratitude in his eyes, mixed with something that looked very much like regret. He seemed to understand that she had carried far more than anyone had realized. Grace answered his glance with a gentle smile that carried neither blame nor disappointment. It was simply reassurance. Watching them together, I felt both admiration and sadness. Admiration because Grace had loved my son with extraordinary patience. Sadness because I had never fully appreciated the quiet sacrifices that patience required. Around us, the room remained warm and beautifully lit, yet the atmosphere had become noticeably heavier. Even Michael's jokes arrived less frequently now. Linda continued speaking with confidence, completely unaware that something invisible had already begun changing inside every person around that table. I found myself no longer waiting to hear what anyone else would say. Instead, I was waiting for Grace. Deep inside, I sensed that she had reached the point where years of quiet understanding were about to become something else entirely. The silence surrounding her no longer felt like absence. It felt like the final breath before a truth too important to remain unspoken any longer. The room had become quieter without anyone intentionally lowering their voice. It was not the comfortable silence that sometimes follows a satisfying family dinner. This silence carried questions that had never been asked aloud. I could almost feel them settling over the polished oak table one by one. Grace rested her hands gently in her lap and listened while the conversation continued around her. She no longer seemed invisible to me. In fact, she had quietly become the center of everything I was thinking. Linda reached for her coffee and smiled as though the evening had unfolded exactly as she expected. She began talking about how families remained strong only when everyone understood their place and respected tradition. Michael nodded enthusiastically before adding that every successful household depended on people who were willing to make sacrifices without complaining. His words were spoken casually, almost carelessly, but they lingered in the air far longer than he intended. I found myself looking at Grace again. If anyone in our family understood sacrifice, it was her. Yet she never seemed interested in reminding people of everything she had quietly given away. Another memory surfaced with remarkable clarity. It happened only a few months after my husband passed away. I had forgotten an important medical appointment because grief had blurred my sense of time. Before I even realized the mistake, Grace appeared at my front door, carrying breakfast, and gently reminded me that she had written the appointment into her own calendar weeks earlier just in case I needed help. She drove me there, sat beside me in the waiting room for nearly 2 hours, and afterward took me to my favorite little diner, because she remembered my husband and I used to stop there every Friday afternoon. She never told anyone she had done those things. Daniel mentioned them months later by accident. Grace simply smiled and changed the subject. At the time, I believed she was naturally humble. Sitting here now, I wondered whether she had simply grown accustomed to believing that kindness did not require recognition. That thought broke my heart. I realized our family had accepted so many quiet gifts that we had forgotten each one represented a choice she made every single day. Across the table, Daniel finally spoke, asking Michael about an upcoming business trip. The conversation shifted for a few minutes toward airports, hotel reservations, and long work schedules. Grace listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions whenever someone else was speaking. She had a remarkable way of making people feel heard without drawing attention back to herself. I suddenly recognized that this quality explained why so many people sought her help outside our family. She listened with genuine curiosity instead of waiting for her turn to speak. That kind of patience had become increasingly rare. Linda eventually returned the conversation to family traditions. She smiled proudly while describing how important it was to preserve respect across generations. The irony almost made me smile sadly. We spoke often about respect, yet I could no longer ignore how unevenly we practiced it. Respect should never depend upon who speaks the loudest or who receives the most attention. Real respect quietly notices the person who keeps everyone else comfortable without expecting applause. I felt embarrassed that it had taken me 72 years to understand something Grace had been demonstrating all along. Looking around the room, I began studying everyone's expressions. Daniel looked restless, as though he sensed an invisible tension he could not quite explain. Michael continued smiling, although his confidence seemed less certain than earlier in the evening. Linda remained completely unaware that her words were slowly exposing assumptions none of us had questioned before. Grace alone appeared perfectly calm. There was no sign of frustration or resentment. Instead, she looked like someone who had finally reached complete peace with a difficult decision. That expression stayed with me because it carried neither fear nor hesitation. It carried quiet certainty. For the first time all evening, I realized Grace was no longer simply enduring the conversation. She was waiting for exactly the right moment. I did not know what she intended to say, but deep inside I felt certain that every memory now filling my heart had been leading toward this single evening. Whatever happened next would not begin in anger. It would begin with truth, and somehow I already knew that truth would be impossible for any of us to ignore once it had finally been spoken. By the time the last cups of coffee had been poured, it felt as though every conversation in the room was only pretending to continue. The words themselves no longer mattered. Something far more important had settled quietly between us, waiting with remarkable patience. I noticed Daniel glancing toward Grace more often now. Each time he looked at her, he seemed ready to say something, yet every opportunity slipped away beneath another ordinary discussion about work, travel, or neighborhood news. Grace never encouraged him to speak. She simply remained composed, listening with the same gentle attention she had offered everyone else all evening. That calm no longer looked effortless to me. It looked earned. Linda straightened the stack of dessert plates beside her and smiled as she admired the family gathered around the table. "This is exactly why traditions matter," she said proudly. "Families stay together because everyone knows their role." Michael nodded immediately before adding that some people naturally became leaders while others were simply happier supporting everyone else. He laughed lightly as though he had shared an innocent observation. Several relatives offered polite smiles. No one challenged him. I felt an uncomfortable weight settle in my chest because I finally understood what Grace had been hearing for years. None of those comments sounded openly cruel. That was precisely what made them so easy to ignore. One sentence alone meant very little. Hundreds of similar moments quietly collected over 12 years became something entirely different. I watched Grace carefully. She lowered her coffee cup onto its saucer with steady hands before folding them together on the table. There was no sign of irritation. No defensive expression crossed her face. She simply looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes for a brief moment as though memorizing the people she loved. I suddenly remembered another afternoon shortly after Daniel and Grace married. We had gathered for a summer barbecue in my backyard. A sudden gust of wind knocked over one of the flower pots my husband had built years earlier. While everyone rushed toward the grill to rescue dinner from the rain, Grace quietly collected every broken piece of pottery before my youngest granddaughter wandered outside barefoot. She never mentioned it afterward. I only remembered because I had watched her from the kitchen window. That memory arrived so clearly that I almost smiled. Grace had always been protecting people, often without them realizing there had ever been anything to protect them from. The realization left me wondering how many unseen acts of kindness had quietly filled the years between that afternoon and tonight. Linda leaned forward again, resting her elbows lightly on the edge of the table. Her voice remained pleasant, but the words carried a sharper edge than before. "Grace," she said, "you have always been such an agreeable person. I cannot remember a single time you have disagreed with anyone in this family." Michael laughed softly. "Maybe that is her secret," he added. "Life stays simple when you never argue." The room responded with uncertain smiles that disappeared almost immediately. Daniel looked down at his hands. I could almost see the conflict written across his face. He wanted to speak, yet years of avoiding confrontation held him in place. Grace slowly turned toward Linda. Her expression remained warm, almost compassionate. There was no trace of wounded pride. Instead, I saw something completely unexpected. I saw peace. Not the peace of someone who had given up, but the peace of someone who no longer feared being misunderstood. That difference changed everything. I realized she was not searching for the right response. She had already found it long before tonight. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to speak. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even Michael stopped smiling. Outside, the evening breeze gently moved the branches of the maple trees beyond the dining room windows. Inside, the ticking clock above the fireplace suddenly sounded louder than the voices around the table. Grace rested one hand lightly beside her coffee cup and took a slow, steady breath. Every eye gradually turned toward her without anyone asking for silence. It happened naturally, as though the entire room understood that the next few seconds would become part of our family's memory forever. In that remarkable stillness, I realized we had all spent years believing Grace had nothing to say. The truth was far simpler and far more humbling. She had been waiting until her words could finally heal more than they hurt. Grace lifted her eyes and looked around the table with the same gentle expression she had worn since the evening began. There was no anger in her face and no desire to embarrass anyone. She simply waited until every conversation faded on its own. Even Linda stopped speaking. The room became so still that I could hear the old clock above the fireplace marking each passing second. Grace took one slow breath before quietly saying, "I was never silent because I was weak. I was silent because I loved this family more than I loved being right." That was all. One sentence. Nothing more. Yet it felt as though every person at the table had forgotten how to breathe. No one reached for a coffee cup. No one adjusted a chair. No one searched for another subject. Her words settled over the room with a calm certainty that no raised voice could ever have matched. I looked toward Daniel first. His eyes filled with emotion as he stared at the woman sitting beside him. It was the expression of someone who had suddenly remembered dozens of moments he wished he could live again. Michael slowly lowered his gaze to the table. The confidence that had fueled his light-hearted remarks disappeared without a single argument. Linda remained perfectly still, her hands resting on the edge of the table as though she had forgotten they were there. I realized that nobody was silent because they had been defeated. They were silent because every one of us recognized the truth in Grace's words. My mind began racing through memory after memory. I saw Grace arriving before sunrise to help prepare holiday meals. I saw her sitting beside me after my husband's funeral when everyone else believed I needed time alone. I saw her carrying groceries to elderly neighbors during winter storms without expecting anyone to notice. I saw birthdays she had quietly organized, hospital visits she had never mentioned, handwritten cards she mailed simply because someone else needed encouragement. Every memory suddenly connected like pieces of a puzzle I had spent years looking at without understanding the picture. Grace had never been asking for recognition. She had been offering love in the simplest ways possible, believing that someday those small acts might become the foundation of a stronger family. Instead, we had slowly mistaken her generosity for obligation. That realization hurt more than I expected. Daniel finally reached for Grace's hand. This time there was no hesitation. He held it gently and whispered, "I am sorry." Grace turned toward him with the same warm smile that had always made people feel safe. She gave the smallest nod, not because the hurt had never existed, but because she understood that sincere regret speaks most honestly when it is simple. Linda blinked several times before quietly clearing her throat. For perhaps the first time in my life, my older sister seemed unsure of what to say. She looked at Grace for a long moment before lowering her eyes. Michael shifted uneasily in his chair, his usual confidence replaced by thoughtful silence. Around the table I noticed something remarkable. Nobody was trying to defend themselves. Nobody offered excuses. There was no debate because the truth did not require one. Grace had not accused anyone. She had not listed old grievances or demanded apologies. She had only explained why she had chosen silence for so many years, and somehow that single sentence forced each of us to examine ourselves far more honestly than criticism ever could have. I felt tears gathering in my own eyes as I realized how completely I had misunderstood my daughter-in-law. I had admired her kindness without understanding its cost. I had appreciated her patience without recognizing the strength required to sustain it. Looking at Grace now, I no longer saw the quiet woman everyone expected to serve another cup of coffee or quietly clean another table. I saw extraordinary courage wrapped in ordinary kindness. At that moment, I understood something I wished I had learned years earlier. The strongest people are often not the ones who speak the most. They are the ones who carry love through disappointment without allowing disappointment to change who they are. And in the peaceful silence that followed Grace's single sentence, our family finally began seeing her exactly as she had always been. The silence that followed Grace's words did not end when someone finally spoke. In many ways, it remained with us long after that evening was over. It settled into our thoughts, quietly changing the way we looked at one another. Linda was the first to break the stillness. She lowered her eyes toward the table before slowly looking back at Grace. For the first time since I had known my older sister, there was no certainty in her expression, only honest reflection. She spoke softly, admitting that somewhere along the way she had stopped noticing how much Grace quietly carried for everyone else. She confessed that kindness had become so familiar that she had mistaken it for something that would always exist no matter how little appreciation it received. There was no dramatic apology and no attempt to explain away the past. Her words were simple, and because they were sincere, they carried real weight. Michael shifted uneasily in his chair. Before looking directly at Grace, he admitted that many of his jokes had only seemed harmless because she had never answered them. Hearing him say those words, I realized he had finally understood that another person's silence should never be mistaken for permission. Daniel reached for Grace's hand once again, this time with complete confidence. He looked into her eyes and quietly said that he had spent too many years believing he was protecting peace by avoiding difficult conversations, when in reality he had allowed silence to protect habits that should have changed long ago. Grace gently squeezed his hand and smiled with the same warmth that had welcomed every member of our family for more than a decade. "We cannot change yesterday," she said softly, "but we can choose what kind of family we become tomorrow." Her words settled naturally into the room, not as a lesson, but as an invitation. Looking around the table, I realized something remarkable had already begun happening. Nobody was defending old behavior anymore. Nobody was counting mistakes. Every person seemed more interested in becoming better than in proving they had been right. We remained together in the kitchen afterward, washing dishes and putting away leftovers. For the first time I could remember, nobody waited for Grace to begin cleaning before offering help. Linda insisted on washing the serving bowls herself. Michael carried stacks of plates to the cabinets without being asked. Daniel dried every glass while Grace laughed quietly at one of my stories about his childhood. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had only an hour earlier. Nothing about the house had changed. The same polished oak table stood in the dining room. The same family photographs covered the hallway walls. The same warm lights glowed from the kitchen ceiling. Yet everything felt different because we were finally seeing one another instead of simply looking at one another. Later that evening, I walked Daniel and Grace to the front porch. A cool breeze moved gently through the maple trees, and the quiet neighborhood rested beneath a sky filled with bright stars. Before they walked toward their car, Grace stepped forward and hugged me. I held her a little longer than usual, because there were feelings words could not fully express. When we finally stepped apart, I looked into her kind eyes and whispered, "Thank you for loving us even when we did not always deserve it." She smiled gently and answered, "Families are not built by perfect people. They are built by people willing to keep choosing one another." After their car disappeared down the quiet street, I remained on the porch for several minutes, thinking about everything that had changed in a single evening. I had spent years believing wisdom naturally arrived with age. Now I understood that wisdom only grows when we are willing to admit we have been wrong. Since that night, our family dinners have continued. We still gather around holiday tables. We still laugh, tell stories, and occasionally disagree. The difference is that gratitude now arrives before expectation. Someone always notices the person pouring coffee. Someone always thanks the person preparing dinner. Someone always asks whether the quietest voice at the table has something to say. And every time I watch Grace smile before joining the conversation, I remember the evening our family finally learned that true strength does not announce itself. It quietly changes hearts until everyone else begins changing too.